If you've played video games or watched movies set during World War II, you've probably noticed that Japanese aircraft carriers have some curious arrow-shaped lines that are very distinctive, always pointing toward the front of the ship. They were everywhere, and we could very often see them next to a huge red dot. These distinctive markings are not decorative and had a very practical reason for existing. So why did the Japanese paint these arrows? Why did they also paint a huge red circle? And also, why did they decide to do away with the red circle at the end of the conflict but not the lines? Well, something we need to understand first before talking directly about the arrows is that in World War II, landing on an aircraft carrier was a very high-risk task. In fact, many airplane squadrons suffered more casualties from operational accidents than from the enemy. And the thing is, in those years, aircraft carriers had only been in standardized use for a few decades. So most of the technologies to ensure safe landings were still in their infancy. To begin with, at that time, landing was almost blind, not to mention the adverse conditions that come with operating at sea. Planes with large engines like the F-4U Corsair or the Supermarine Sapphire left very little forward visibility for the pilot to find the tiny runway. And they relied heavily on the signals they received from the ground crew to land. The aircraft carrier runways were completely straight, so if an accident happened, the plane would skid down the entire runway and crash into other parked aircraft. All of that, combined with the movement of the sea, made landing a really complex and dangerous task. All of that was on the Allied side, and on the Japanese side it was even worse. The Japanese aircraft carriers had smokestacks facing downward on the sides of the carriers. This reduced turbulence on the flight deck and kept it clearer. But when the carrier turned, all the smoke would cover the deck. The Zeros were marvels of maneuverability, but they were structurally weak, making them prone to damage just from landing. In fact, accidents on the Japanese side increased as the war went on. The demand for pilots increased, which meant pilot training had to be reduced. And since there were fewer and fewer aces to train the rookies, training got worse. However, operationally, Japanese aircraft carriers had particular features that Allied carriers could only envy. On the flight deck, we had many indicators, and in particular, the arrow was used to specifically and creatively show the direction of the wind. The lines were arranged to form an arrow pointing away from the pilot at the exact point where the lines meet. There was a small release of steam, a common byproduct of aircraft carrier engines from that era. At their ends, they were separated at intervals of 10 degrees each, and the small central lines marked increments of 5 degrees. When the engine was running, steam came out of the opening and was pushed backward by the wind on the deck, and this steam flowed along one of the lines. By indicating the wind direction clearly, Japanese pilots could see the wind direction in real time during takeoff and landing, and thus, if there was a change, they could anticipate it. Pilots needed to know the wind direction for an important reason. Aircraft carriers are usually operated into the wind during operations to generate wind over the deck. This way, the extra lift that the planes get can be used, and as a result, that lift makes it easier to take off and land. However, at sea, the wind direction and its speed are rarely constant. It's necessary to know the wind direction, since landing on the small deck was a process that required precision. And a delayed reaction to a sudden change in the wind could cause the pilot to miss the approach, having to abort the entire landing. Even if the sudden change happened at the last second, it could cause the pilot to crash on the runway. The arrow solution was, without a doubt, very clever and practical. Another incredible mechanism that the Allies didn't have was the Shakanshidoto, an extremely advanced system for its time. Landing on Japanese aircraft carriers was quite different from what we can see on the Allied side on Allied aircraft carriers. There was always an officer on deck called the LSO who gave real-time signals to the pilots. As we mentioned, the pilot could rarely see directly onto the runway, so their instructions were really helpful. On Japanese aircraft carriers, there wasn't an officer with such responsibility. Was there something similar? For example, there was a commanding officer in the tower called Shichuku, who was the supervisor in charge of all operations. He had several assistants on the deck, like the Seiseiben, who did not give landing signals like the American signal officers. But they did indicate to the pilots whether it was safe to land or not. Instead of relying on a man, the Japanese used a light guidance system. It consisted of 2 red lights located at the level of the command cabin and 15 meters ahead. There were 4 more green lights, all with mirrors to focus the beam of light at a distance. The angle of the lights was changed according to the size of the plane. The trick was that when you were about to land, you had to maneuver the plane so that the red lights were just below the green lights. If you only saw red lights, it meant you were flying too low, and if you saw that the lights were very far apart, it meant you were flying too high. This way, pilots could land both during the day and at night, extremely reliably. Now why? The Japanese aircraft carrier used to have a huge red dot in the center. Although it may seem like a very aesthetic way to represent the Japanese rising sun, it actually had a practical reason. The big red dot on the deck, it made it easier to see the aircraft carrier from hundreds of kilometers away, standing out against the Pacific Ocean, and it was used as a reference point to align the plane with the carrier for landing. It was visible even in the worst weather conditions. However, the Japanese did not consider that this could be used against them. The American dive bombers began to use these circles as targets. Although it wasn't in the heart of the aircraft carrier, destroying this area rendered the runway completely unusable, turning the carrier into an expensive cruise ship. So after the Midway disaster, Japanese aircraft carriers stopped using the red dot en masse. If you like these facts, maybe you'd like to know why submarine propellers must always be hidden. Thanks for watching this video and goodbye.